Good afternoon. I am Sherry Trimble, Museum Educator at the State Museum of Pennsylvania. This session is being recorded early next week. Our plan is to send the recording out to the email you supplied during sign-up. We'll be using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen for any questions. At the end of the program, there will be a question and answer period. Please feel free to add your questions to that box throughout the program. In the chat box is the PHMC's etiquette and policies and other important links. Now I would like to turn it over to our museum director, Beth Hager.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for our weekly Learn at Lunchtime series that we just launched online this month. We're off to a great start. This month, we've already heard from a Pulitzer Prize-winning Pennsylvania photographer and from our resident herpetologist on how frogs and snakes survive the winter. So there's something for everybody. Since we continue to be closed due to the pandemic, our museum staff will be connecting with you each Friday to bring you Pennsylvania's stories featuring special guests and colleagues. Before I introduce today's program, I'd like to make a quick pitch to invite you to join me next Friday, February 26th, when I'll be talking with our museum educators about upcoming virtual planetarium shows, Homeschool Day Online, virtual field trips, and a variety of lifelong learning opportunities for all. But today we're pleased to kick off Curator's Choice, which will take place every third week of the month. I'm pleased to introduce Bradley Smith to bring you the first talk in the series. Brad has worked in various capacities with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission since 2001, including service as the curator at the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania and also as the State Museum's chief curator. He has also been an adjunct professor in history with Alvernia University since 2005. And now Brad is back with us at the State Museum, and he's coordinating a major new comprehensive plan to upgrade the museum's permanent exhibits and enhance visitor amenities. He's doing that as our program director. He's also curating this Curator's Choice series and is presenting today A Spirited Republic Whiskey Distilling in Pennsylvania. Brad tells us that his interest in distilling history stems from the prominence of several historic distilleries in his hometown of Schaefferstown in Lebanon County, Pennsylvania. So Brad, thank you today for joining us, giving us this first Curator's Choice program, and congrats generally on kicking off this series.
Thank you, Beth. If you'll bear with me a moment, I will turn on my PowerPoint presentation. Something that I think many Pennsylvanians in the 21st century don't understand is how prominent the use of liquor was in the 1700s and early 1800s. The use of distilled spirits was pervasive. A book on the subject called The Alcoholic Republic by William J. Rohrbaugh discusses this. In the book, Rohrbaugh says, distilled spirits were viewed as foods that supplemented limited and monotonous diets, as medications that could cure colds, fevers, snake bites, frosted toes, and even broken legs, as relaxants that would relieve depression, reduce tension, and enable hardworking laborers to enjoy a moment of happy, frivolous camaraderie. Rohrbaugh adds that such favorable views led to a widespread use of strong drink. And if we look at statistical data, they support what Rohrbaugh claims in his book. And you can see on this chart that particularly in 1820, we had a spike in consumption of distilled spirits, with the average adult consuming over 5 gallons in 1820. That's about 6 times the average for 2021. Part of the reason for this was it was a matter of practicality. in the era before refrigeration, beverage options were simply limited. The knowledge of distilling has been around for centuries. And in fact, in what is today Germany, the first publication on the subject was released in 1500, The Art of Distillation. And this was so popular that in 1512, they printed an expanded second edition. A well-known English treatise on distillation was printed in 1651. And by the 1700s, Pennsylvanians had already been a part of a long tradition of whiskey distilling. And this screen shows a sample of an estate inventory of a man in Berks County who, when he passed away in 1754, had a still in his property. While Pennsylvanians were distilling whiskey in the 1700s, one of our most popular beverages was actually rum that came to us from the Caribbean. Actually, we had rum coming directly from the Caribbean, and in North America, there was also a lot of distilling of rum, which depended on either molasses or sugar, which was imported from the Caribbean. So that was probably our most popular alcoholic beverage of the 1700s. However, this changed with the American Revolution. When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, suddenly the British blockaded imports into North America, and we suddenly were cut off from that supply of rum and from the sugar and molasses we needed to distill our own rum. So these farmers in Pennsylvania who were already distilling whiskey suddenly had a great opportunity, because whiskey produced in Pennsylvania could be made completely from domestic products, particularly rye, and also apples were often used in whiskey, and to a lesser extent, corn was used. In 1777, George Stephenson of Carlisle talked about this, and he says, "The inhabitants of this state have distilled nearly all of the rye, and now I am told they are beginning to distill wheat, because whiskey is now sold at between 6 and 7 shillings per gallon. If this destruction of wheat is not stopped, it will enhance the price of bread and occasion some degree of famine." And again, this is very much due to the fact that suddenly rum is unavailable, and thus the demand for domestically produced whiskey just skyrocketed. Looking at Berks County, an area I've studied quite extensively, you can kind of see that this change, the shift to more domestic production of alcoholic beverages, resulted in an increase in distillers in Berks County from 49 in 1786 to 81 by 1798. So nearly double in just a 12-year period. And just an interesting side note, it was also during this period in 1797 that George Washington also entered the distilling business, beginning his distillery at his property in Mount Vernon. By 1800, we had many, many small-scale distilleries in Pennsylvania. I have not dug into all the counties, but here you can see a chart showing some of what I found in some of the central Pennsylvania counties like York and Lancaster. And in particular, you see that York had an especially high concentration of distillers. It was also during this time when whiskey distilling was expanding and increasing that the United States initiated a tax on whiskey known colloquially as the whiskey tax. And many of you probably are aware that this led to the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania, where angry distillers protested this whiskey tax. Interestingly, this was not really a big deal in central Pennsylvania. In fact, Edward Hand, he was an inspector of revenue in Lancaster County, and he reported, writing in the third person, the inspector thinks it is his duty to declare that of the many distillers he has conversed with, he has not found one unwilling to comply with the law, although few, if any, appear to understand it. To have a whiskey distillery in central Pennsylvania, one needed a few basic essential items. The first was a still house. And we see this over and over in historic records, such as this will, where people who are known distillers make reference to their still house. And there is some, we have some records related to what these still houses look like. For example, here's one in York County. Here's one in Lancaster County. Here's one in Berks County. So these were generally small to medium-sized buildings that would have been erected on a farm. Probably the most important requirement for a still house is that it needed to be near a supply of water, because water was needed for the distilling process. One also needed a copper still, such as this one. And these were actually quite attainable in central Pennsylvania. And this is just an example of a German language advertisement in the Reading Adler newspaper in the early 1800s, showing that this is a coppersmith who has stills available for sale. This is a drawing that actually shows a French distillery in 1751, but this is very similar to a two-still operation, which one might have seen on a farm in central Pennsylvania. And in fact, there's some archaeological evidence that are very similar to, that show a situation very similar to what is conveyed by this drawing. To operate a still, most farmers typically just took this job on by themselves. Their families would operate the stills. But in some instances, there's evidence that, especially in the mid-1700s, more successful farmers who had larger distilling operations would hire indentured or bring on indentured servants to help them work in the stills or work their distillery operation. And also the most successful would actually hire individuals to help them with the distilling operations. Here's an advertisement in Lancaster, and here's a German language advertisement seeking a distiller who can be well recommended in York, Pennsylvania in 1796. Most Pennsylvanians were farmers who treated distilling and the production of whiskey as one component of their overall farm operations. But some individuals really focused specifically on distilling. They made that their primary product, their primary operation. One is a fellow named John Christian who lived in Berks County. And he actually wrote an autobiography talking about his experiences as a distiller. And it's quite entertaining, actually, because he tended to complain a lot about anything that didn't suit him. In particular, he enjoyed complaining about his business partner with whom he started this distilling operation. And here's a quote from his autobiography. He says, "During the time I lived in Reading, I was chiefly occupied in the distilling business. I had to make 100 shifts to get along somehow, and it cost me a many sleepless night. while my business partner would go to a tavern and play at cards, thinking himself rich and scarcely ever showing his face in the still house. Something very interesting about whiskey distilling in Pennsylvania is that the finished product was often shipped by Conestoga wagon quite some distance. In some of our more eastern counties like Lancaster and Berks, Lebanon and Dauphin, the product was shipped by Conestoga wagon to Philadelphia. In York and Adams, places like that, it would have been shipped to Baltimore. And we know in large part what products they were shipping because these are advertised. This is an example of a German language advertisement in the Reading Adler newspaper in 1818. And it's telling us that two of the big products that are being sought after at markets in Reading and Philadelphia are rye whiskey and apple whiskey. There are many, many records just showing us the level of product being shipped. And I just have a few examples, two examples here. For example, Henry Schaefer, who was a farmer in what's today Lebanon County. At the time, it was Dauphin County. He sells a large quantity of whiskey, actually partnering with a local merchant. And they sold this whiskey to a Philadelphia firm for 65 pounds, 10 shillings and 6 pence. At about the same time, Berks County merchants were selling large quantities of whiskey to another Philadelphia firm. And again, this was just this was a profitable venture for these Pennsylvanians and could earn a very dependable amount of money for them. We also have records that whiskey was shipped on the Schuylkill Canal, which was completed in 1825, connecting Berks County with Philadelphia. While a lot of whiskey was shipped to cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, a lot of whiskey stayed right in the local area. Taverns were very, very prominent in central Pennsylvania, and taverns had a great demand for distilled spirits. And just to give you an idea of how common they were, in 1831, a report noted that 125 taverns were in operation in Dauphin County, 293 taverns were operating in Lancaster County. Another interesting aspect of whiskey distilling is that it resulted in spent grain, which could then be fed to livestock. Particularly pigs seem to be well suited to eat the spent grain used in the distilling process. I mentioned earlier that Washington had a distillery at Mount Vernon, and a visitor to Mount Vernon talked about this. He said, if this distillery offers poison for men, it offers in return the most delicate and the most succulent feed for pigs. They are so excessively bulky that they can hardly drag their big bellies on the ground. And there are many records that show that there was a correlation between pork production and whiskey distilling in Pennsylvania because of this. For example, here's an estate inventory in Berks County where a known distiller also has 500 pounds of pork. Our friend John Christian in Berks County also talked about this. Once again, grumbling a little bit, saying that the hogs and stormy nights in winter would require all the time I was able to bestow. There are also in advertisements for real estate for sale, there's a correlation such as this one from Lancaster, where properties that included a still house many times often included a hog house or a pigsty, further giving us further evidence of that connection between distilling and pork production. One of the most interesting examples of this connection can be seen at the Henry Schaefer Distillery in Schaefferstown, Pennsylvania. And we have there at this site not only the existing still house, we have an existing pigsty and a smokehouse.
So we've got about 4 minutes left. I want to remind everybody that if you do have any questions for Brad, we're going to be doing that after part 3. Put those in the question and answer part on the bottom, not the chat box.
Previously, I had shown this graphic showing that whiskey distilling, or the consumption of distilled spirits, I should say, reached an all-time peak in 1820. But as you can see, it sharply declined thereafter. And by 1895, it was 1/5 of what it had been just 2 generations earlier. And it's important to kind of understand why that happened, how that happened. And it really was about 3 or 4 factors. And here's just some evidence of the decline in distilling. For example, 1849, Berks County, which had 86 or 81 distilleries in 1798, was down to only 10, at least only 10 licensed operations by 1852. Distilling didn't disappear, but it changed. We went from many, many small farm distilleries to a much smaller handful of larger commercial operations, such as this one in Reading, Pennsylvania, the Neversink Distillery. Part of the reason for I'd say probably the biggest reason for the decline in whiskey distilling was the temperance movement. Temperance movement emerges in the 1820s. It's kind of a byproduct of the Second Great Awakening, a religious movement in the United States in the early 1800s. And by the late 1830s, 7% of the US population is involved with a chapter of the American Temperance Society. And this really did have an impact on the way Americans viewed hard liquor. Another big change was more diversity in beverage options, particularly the advent of lager beer distilleries, breweries in the United States in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. And some of the predecessor companies to very well-known brands had their start in this time period. And this meant competition for whiskey. Also, we had industrialization. Here's a photograph from 1848 showing the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad locomotive Tioga. With the advent of railroads, with more industrial growth, it meant that it was more efficient, for more possible to have a large-scale whiskey distilling operation. And as a result, by the year 2000, and really for much of the late 19th and 20th century, nearly 100% of all whiskey distilled in the United States was done in a small handful of large factories. This photograph shows the Jim Beam factory as an example. One interesting sort of epilogue, though, to this is just in the last 15 years in Pennsylvania, laws have changed that have made it much easier to operate small-scale distilleries. So we're seeing in Pennsylvania a sort of renaissance in this idea of the small-scale whiskey distillery. However, this so far has only made a small impact in the production of large distilling factories like Jim Beam. 95% of our whiskey still comes from large factories. So that's my quick whirlwind tour through whiskey distilling in central Pennsylvania. I'd be very happy to answer any questions you might have.
We have several already that are already in the chat. And Brad and I were discussing that before this. We're flexible on time as long as everybody's flexible on time. If for some reason you need to pop off and we don't get to your question, in the chat box, you'll see my email, ctrimble@pa.gov. Pop me an email and we'll get back to it. So, but let's get started. So first question is talking about health consideration. Of course, the issues when we first started whiskey production, water was an issue. What were their thoughts on whiskey as a health option?
The general thinking was that in many places there was some hesitancy to drink water. And excuse me 1 second, I might have I forget if no, I didn't, sorry. I thought I had maybe an extra slide in there about this. But generally there was some hesitancy to drink water because of health concerns, especially in the cities where sometimes getting fresh, clean water was a challenge. The thinking was that distilling was, or distilled spirits were healthier. And in fact, one of the things that's really strange to us is that sometimes whiskey was given to children. It wasn't strange to give a little bit of whiskey to a child, especially a child who was kind of fussy or not wanting to settle down or go to sleep. Whiskey was given to workers as compensation. And I do have a slide on this right here. Apologize again for flipping through quickly. 1797 in Berks County, they were giving whiskey as payment to workers. So it was kind of considered a good supplement with nutrition, with nutritional value.
So early on, Quakers and Amish, what were their thoughts on alcohol?
It's a good question. I'm not sure exactly with the Amish, but I do know Mennonites did not have qualms about whiskey distilling. I haven't really seen evidence of Amish distilling. One thing I have noticed though is there doesn't seem to be as many distillers in among the Quakers. That's I could be mistaken about that, but to me the sort of gut feeling I have is that it just wasn't as prominent among them.
How did you go about finding your research? Somebody specifically was talking about Clearfield and Center counties.
Good question. So I have a slide that highlights this. So this is a picture of me many years ago. And I often joke, you can tell how old a photograph of me is by how much hair I have. And I have not had this much hair in 25 years.
I didn't say when we were in school together.
Yeah, Sherry and I were classmates in college. I have not had that much hair in 25 years. So I've been researching this topic for at least that long, probably since I was about 15. And this is me actually speaking at the Henry Schaefer Distillery in Lebanon County. But to directly answer that question, one of I like tax records. Tax records beginning in 1780 show who has stills on their property. The 1798 direct tax has nice information on still houses. Estate inventories have excellent information on not only who has stills, but oftentimes they can tell you what products they were producing, what equipment they were using. So for example, what I would often do is I'd look at a tax record for a certain township, and I'd look to see who on the tax records have a still. And then I'd look for more detailed information on those people, such as their will, such as an estate inventory. And I've found a tremendous amount of information that way.
So York County being so prolific, did you see any kind of relationship with perhaps the groups of people living there, the Protestants or other groups?
My gut feeling, and I feel like I've seen enough information to suggest this, but not to prove it. My gut feeling is that the number one distilling group, the people who are most involved in distilling, were the Pennsylvania Germans who were living in Berks, Lancaster, York County. I feel like more research is needed before I can say that for certain. And in particular, Pennsylvania Germans who are from Lutheran and German Reformed backgrounds. And I think part of this is because the Pennsylvania Germans had a very scientific approach to agriculture, and they were very interested in and pioneering in crop rotation, the use of fertilizer, the use of lime in their fields. And I think for them, this sort of scientific approach to farming was a good fit for whiskey distilling, which in and of itself was a science. There's a lot of science involved in the process. It's a fairly complex process.
So kind of sticking with that, Lancaster County, in the 18th century, did you see a good percentage of people that were distilling just for their own personal family use, or were they mostly doing it to sell?
That's a good question. Unfortunately, we just don't have, we only know as much as the records tell us. And for example, I showed you some examples where we have documentation of farmers or merchants selling to Philadelphia, selling to Baltimore. But for every 50 distillers that were producing whiskey, I might only have information on to whom they were selling for 3 of them. So unfortunately, we just aren't sure. But one thing we can do is we can guess by the size of their the size of their operation. For example, if they had 1 still, it's more likely it was just for their use. If they had 2 or 3 or 4 stills, it's more likely that their interest was commercial.
How do we compare to other states? Are we more significant, about the same?
That's a good question. I'd say we are. I haven't studied other states enough to know to say definitively, but I feel like Pennsylvania has got to be a leader. For example, William Rohrbaugh in his book, his estimate was that there were 2,000 distilleries in the United States in the early 1800s. But I know just in Lancaster and York County, we had 500 in that period. So I think this is a question that requires more research, but sort of my gut feeling is that we were absolutely a leader in distilling and whiskey production.
So, and I'm curious about this question. When you were talking about the Whiskey Rebellion and that it mostly was something that the western part of the state was concerned with, why do you think that was that big difference between the two?
That's a great question. And I've thought about this quite a bit. I think it comes down to about 3 or 4 factors. One is that in central Pennsylvania, the farmers were a little more established. They were second and third generation inhabitants on their farms. They had more diverse production on their farms. They had more disposable income on their farms. They had better access to transportation, and they had better access to currency. In Western Pennsylvania, transportation was more difficult. Currency was in short supply, so they actually literally would use their whiskey as a sort of currency. And they were, frankly, that was in the 1790s. Western Pennsylvania was the frontier, and they were just a little more limited in the economics of farm production, agriculture in Western Pennsylvania. So I think for them, this whiskey tax tended to be more detrimental to their bottom line.
Mhm.
Whereas in central Pennsylvania, they were able to weather that a little easier.
This is a fun question. Did different counties or different areas develop regional flavors to their whiskey?
That's an excellent question.
No, I'd want to know.
I feel like I can't give an answer without guessing. There were a number of publications out there. For example, one that was very, very common was published in Philadelphia in 1813. It was called Hall's Distiller. And we know that people in central Pennsylvania read this book because it was advertised in local newspapers. And Hall kind of had recipes that he made available, and people kind of tweak those. And he talked about, in Hall's Distiller, he talks about how Lancaster in particular has sort of their own unique way of producing apple whiskey. There were other books out there on whiskey manufacturing, also published in Philadelphia, also available in central Pennsylvania, that would have influenced how people manufactured their whiskey. But I really think there was a lot of experimentation involved. There's a book, it's called Bourbon Empire, and I forget the author off the top of my head, but in Bourbon Empire, that book talks a lot about how whiskey distilling really was experimental, that they were just kind of throwing stuff in and seeing how it turned out. And so to answer that question, I think the answer is yes, though I don't have a good guess as to the extent of the variety, or if there were certain recipes for certain areas.
I'm going to make a comment, Brad. Can you stop sharing for a minute just so we can have us on the screen for
Sure.
a little bit? All right. Now, this was a comment, but I'm going to turn it into a question because I find this fascinating. So somebody was commenting about the Rohrbaugh book that you were mentioning, and they were talking about the fact of that whiskey was mostly a white man's drink, that women were not drinking this. African Americans and indentured servants and slave people were most likely drinking this. So just your thoughts on that.
Well, that is an interesting comment.
I know, I like that.
I think it just, there was a culture, and it's a culture that's kind of hard for us to wrap our heads around because it is so different. Our thinking on alcohol was very much shaped by the temperance movement, and it was a different culture back then. And just as today there are things that are considered culturally acceptable, culturally unacceptable, there was a culture of alcohol, an alcohol culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel like I have the expertise to comment as to why it developed that way, but only to acknowledge that it did exist, and there was a uniqueness to it that when I read about some of these things today through the lens of a 21st century person, it really seems baffling to me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Flipping the topic now. Now we're getting into recipes. Did you ever in your research see any historic recipes for whiskey?
I've seen some, and just as a side note, there was a local distillery in my hometown that actually evolved from one of those small farm distilleries to a much larger operation. And when I was a child, that operation was called Michter's Distillery. And for many a young adult living where I did, drinking your first Michter's was sort of a rite of passage. And we always thought of that as sort of our local recipe. Later on, I learned that the Michter's recipe of the late 1980s was not one of those local centuries old recipes, but was something much more modern that actually came out of Kentucky. So to answer that question, I thought my favorite local recipe was the Michter's recipe until I learned that it actually comes from Kentucky.
Still good though.
And in fact, Schaefferstown, Lebanon County, the recipe for Michter's that was last used when they closed down in 1989 was developed by the nephew of Jim Beam.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like a wise tale, but that's actually a true story.
He wishes he made as much as Jim Beam, though. Oh, by the way, we are just hold on to your pants because we are up to 38 questions right now. So we'll keep going.
I'm happy to take them on and try my best to answer them. I'm excited.
I know, this is great.
We appreciate the interest. So thank you for your questions.
Okay, so thoughts on Back to the Whiskey Rebellion. Oh, it moved on me. Do you think it was the big whiskey makers that kind of sparked the rebellion, or do you think it was the little local farmers?
Well, again, it was in Western Pennsylvania, which demographically in 1790s, Western Pennsylvania is very different from Lancaster County, York County, Dauphin County. Just a very, very different environment, different people, different economy. I think the people that were most fired up were small scale farmers. Mm-hmm. But they did have some more affluent people that got involved. Probably the most famous example is David Bradford, who was not a farmer. If I recall, he was an attorney. And he was sort of kind of a ringleader. He was someone that the local farmers looked to as a community leader, and that's how he got involved. So I think there was a partnership of small farmers and community leaders, but I don't think you had the larger distilleries out there that you had in central Pennsylvania. And when I say larger, I mean still farm operated distilleries, but maybe with 3 employees and 4 stills.
Yeah. So are the oak barrels really a thing? Do they all have to be in those oak barrels?
I think that depends who you ask.
Yeah, Jim Beam, I'm sure would tell you that. So did changing in agriculture have any effect on the decline of distilling?
That's a great question. Agriculture absolutely did change, but I think in part the change in agriculture was based on like the decline in distilling facilitated the change in agriculture rather than vice versa. And we see this today with Pennsylvania farmers. Pennsylvania farmers frequently adjust their products. You might see corn being grown, and more recently, I've seen more wheat being grown, and it's just the market that influences that, or the market influences farmers to start growing soybeans or to grow tobacco. In Pennsylvania, tobacco really started taking off right as distilling was declining. So for example, 1850, I think it was Pennsylvania farmers produced 2 million pounds. I forget it was 2 million pounds or 2 million tons of tobacco, but it's not a small amount. By 1880, that number was up to 30 million. Yeah, it was by 1880, we were up, well, really over 40 million pounds of tobacco produced in Pennsylvania. So it really, if there was any loss in economic opportunity through the decline of distilling, tobacco more than made up for it. Now, that said, I should also point out that of all that tobacco, Lancaster was a huge, huge part of that, Lancaster County farmers.
Maybe that should be our next topic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to tilt your camera a little bit more? You're like Killjoy.
And incidentally, Pennsylvania in the late 1800s was the nation's third largest producer of tobacco.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of cigar factories in
I
Pennsylvania.
was just thinking that.
Late
You
1800s.
said that. Yep. And cigar
Pennsylvania-
box makers.
Yeah, absolutely. Pennsylvania might have been number one, except we specialized in tobacco for cigar smoking or for cigar making, but not cigarette making. And so that's, as a result, the growth in our tobacco economy would only go so far.
Difference, moonshine, whiskey. What's the difference?
The simple explanation is the process is a little different. The ingredients are a little different. Moonshine is done a little more, how do I say it? Informally.
Mm-hmm.
There are actually some really good articles out there on the subject, articles about what goes into making moonshine and things like that. If anyone's interested, I actually have links handy. I'd be glad to share them. If you email Sherry, and if you have any questions that you'd like to have us follow up on, if you email Sherry Trimble, Sherry will get them to me, and we can share answers. We can share links. The process of making whiskey is actually quite complex. There's 4 steps to it. Distilling is the 4th and final step. And I thought about discussing that, but I felt it was just a little too complex. So if anyone's interested in that, again, I'd be happy to email you some resources on that, on the difference between whiskey and moonshine, things like that.
That kind of goes with the next question. What was like the average size still, like in the 1800s?
That's a good question. The average size was probably about the size of, just to create a visual picture, about the size of a large beach ball.
Okay.
But it varied, and again, it depended on, you kind of had 2 considerations. How large do you want your still to be? And how often do you want to be operating your still? Large still, infrequently operated, will produce a lower amount, but small still, if you run it every day, will produce a larger amount. So there were considerations of what's the gallon capacity of my still, and what's the gallon of whiskey production that I want to be creating. And size of still and the amount of work one put into it both influenced those numbers.
I think we answered this question, but I may reword this, because this question was, were women equal consumers, which they weren't. Do you know of any women that actually produced any?
That's a great question. I have never seen a will or an estate inventory of a woman where whiskey was discussed. No, I take that back. I have seen it. But sort of the implied message was it would be a situation, for example, where the husband was distilling, he passed away, his wife inherited the property, and the suggestion of surviving documentation implies that sons then operated the distillery on their mom's property. But that's a good question, and I don't feel like I don't feel great confidence with that answer. And I think because it gets down to something I said earlier, we only know as much as the documentation reveals. And it just doesn't say a whole lot about this, about the role of women in distilling. But the fact that there isn't much said about it suggests that they did not have a large role in it.
Yeah. Well, let's see. We're going to try and keep going through these. We are getting on 107, but keep going. Let's see. Do we know how the raw product would compare to ABV in current whiskey? I don't know.
I think rather than answer that question incorrectly, what I'd like to do is share some web links.
Yeah.
That can explore that question.
You know what we could do, because what I typically do probably Monday or Tuesday of next week is I will send out the recording to everybody who is registered. And if you send me those links, then I can send them out to everybody.
Sure. Sounds good.
That sounds good. All right. This is an interesting one. So rum was often added to soldiers' canteens, particularly French and Indian War, to kill bacteria. Do you know of any of this with whiskey or anything?
I don't. Now, and what's interesting, rum was also a part of the daily rations in the Continental Army, which actually is an interesting situation in that at that point, it's hard to get rum in the United States. And my assumption, my best guess is that whiskey would have been used in place of this rum ration for soldiers, but I've never found proof of it. It's just my best guess.
Mm-hmm. You had one graphic where you talked about the difference of Berks County, where over 2 years it went from 15 distilleries to 2. What was that big drastic difference? You remember that graphic?
Boy, those numbers don't sound familiar to me.
All right. Well, let's move on because we still have several questions. When was rye replaced as the most popular grain? You see a change in the grains?
Rye, I think rye and wheat were both very, very popular in the 1700s. In particular, I'd say wheat was more popular than rye as a crop. And frankly, what was happening was central Pennsylvania farmers were producing lots and lots of wheat, and they would send that by Conestoga wagon to your port cities, Philadelphia to Baltimore. And a lot of that wheat ended up going to the Caribbean, where it would be used to feed enslaved workers working in sugar plantations. As far as rye declining in popularity, I'd say that was sort of an 1800s trend, and I could be mistaken about that. What's interesting, though, is in the 20th century, early distillers tended to like a certain variation of rye, and I forget the species off the top of my head, but they had a very distinct preference for for this type of rye, and for a variety of reasons, that that sort of heirloom variety of rye was lost for a number of years, and now sort of agricultural scientists are trying to bring it back. I apologize if I can't remember the exact type.
Well, we are going to wrap it up with one more question, and I know there are still several more, but we do want to kind of keep a little bit to the hour time slot. So once again, if you didn't get to any of our questions, I tried to get the big bulk of ones, send us an email, but I like this question. Were there any specific bottles and Boss bottles special that were local to distilleries?
It's a good question. In the 1700s and early 1800s, not that I've ever seen. They pretty much used just, they would fill their wholesale product in large barrels known as hogsheads. And then when they were actually serving it in a tavern or what have you, it was typically just in a non-distinct glass bottle. That said, when we get into the 1850s, 60s, 70s, and you see larger commercial whiskey distilleries in Pennsylvania, in places like Reading and so forth, they did have uniquely marked bottles, and you can still find them sometimes. And actually, even some of the earliest ones in like the 1850s, they use stoneware jugs. And I actually saw recently a Neversink distillery jug that sold at auction, a stoneware jug from about the 1850s. That's probably about the earliest I've ever seen for a marked whiskey container.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brad. It was a great program, and great questions from everybody. So the next program that we're going to be having with the Curator's Choice, which Bradley Smith will be the host then. He's going to be hosting Kirk Carr, Dr. Carr, and we're going to be talking about deadly contact, Europeans, Native Americans in pandemic. That's a month from now on March 19th. And then we have several more programs that are going to be coming up. As a reminder, next week we'll send this recording to the email you provided and on our social media platforms. If you're interested in donating to support these programs, I included a link, and I also will put it in the email to support the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation. Don't forget to sign up for next week's program or any of our programs with our director, Beth Hager, and our education department as we discuss our virtual group programs. This link is at the bottom there to sign up for any future Learn at Lunchtime programs. Once again, thank you for attending and have a great weekend.